Welcome to California Now, a podcast produced by Visit California. I'm Satirius Johnson. Today, we hit the road. It's a special turbocharged edition of the podcast. We have a full tank of gas, chrome wheels, and ahead of us, an open road.
Getting in a car and driving is such a wonderful way to not only experience the landscape of a place, but to give yourself the freedom to stop and, do the unexpected.
That's travel insider Nathan Lump. He's just one of the guests we'll revisit on this road trip edition of the podcast. Some say that unstructured time is the new luxury, and there's no better way to open yourself to new experiences than on the open roads of California. So in the next half hour, relax and let your imagination take you across the state with some of our favorite guests. Buckle up and take a ride with California Now. Welcome to a special edition of the California Now podcast. I'm your host, Satirius Johnson. Each episode, we do our best to introduce you to people and places that make California such an exciting place to visit. But what if you're one of those people for whom the journey is the destination? Well, there's a long tradition of hitting the road here. It goes back to the beginnings of statehood when prospectors wheeled their way to the Golden State. This road winds through the stories of John Steinbeck, through the songs of Woody Guthrie, to the Beach Boys and beyond, and it co-stars in films like Easy Rider and Rain Man. Today, we honor the California road trip. In its modern form, your adventure probably begins with your arrival by air. Rent a car and you're ready to hit the road. You'll never run out of exciting destinations, and just maybe it'll be the journey itself that sticks with you for a lifetime. We'll start about 100 miles north of San Francisco in Anderson Valley. It's part of Mendocino County and contains beautiful coastline, agricultural areas, and well-established vineyards. Recently, I spoke to travel expert Nathan Lump, and he told me a great story about exploring Anderson Valley by car.
I'd never been there, and I was going to be in Napa for a birthday celebration. And so I said to my husband, let's get in the car and drive up there, because it's a part of California I've never experienced before, and it sounds really, really awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like the perfect little road trip. And speaking of road trips, it seems like the entire category is having a moment right now. Why do you think road trips seem so appealing these days?
I think people like the idea of slowing down a little bit and kind of immersing themselves in places that, getting in a car and driving is such a wonderful way to not only experience the landscape of a place, but to give yourself the freedom to stop and, do the unexpected. In fact, on our trip, we drove up from Calistoga. We took 128 out of Calistoga up towards Mendocino, and had one of those serendipitous moments where we found ourselves at a certain point where we were hungry for lunch, and we weren't quite exactly where we thought we were going to be at that moment, because we left a little bit later. And so we did this detour. We went up on Highway 101. We got off the 128 and went to Hopland, which is not necessarily a notable thing. But when we were going back then to get into Anderson Valley, because we took that detour, we ended up on this little road called Mountain House Road that took us back to the 128. And that road was unbelievably beautiful. It's kind of winding through the hills and dales of Anderson Valley, surrounded by agricultural land, and it was such a treat. And we never would have been on that road if we hadn't made that detour.
If you don't mind, I'd like to climb into the passenger seat and join you on a recap of the journey.
Anderson Valley, if you haven't been there, is like people often say Sonoma's like Napa 20 years ago. Anderson Valley is really like Sonoma 20 years ago.
Wow.
It's it feels really agricultural, super kind of local. When you go into a tasting room, you're often tasting with the winemaker or the owner of the vineyard or winery. And everybody's like, it's super chill and friendly, and people give you more ideas of other places to go. Like the first place we stopped on the way in on 128 was a place called Yorkville Cellars, which is basically the first one you come to. And And the guy who owns it, who's there doing the tasting, he knows that he's probably your first stop. And so one of the things he does when you're done with your tasting is he pulls out the map and goes through all of the wineries in Anderson Valley with you, and gives you his recommendations. It's such a nice experience. It feels It's really warm and actually really helpful. Another one of the places that we stopped after that was another place called Pennyroyal Farm, which is a winery, but also a working farm, and they raise goats and make their own cheese. And so one of the things that's awesome there is that you can do a wine and cheese pairing kind of tasting, which is such a nice experience to have the wine with some food, and their cheeses are really awesome. So that was a great place. And then we stopped in Boonville, which is one of the little towns, like adorable little town. Got some ice cream at a place called Paysan, and there's a wonderful store there called Farmhouse Mercantile, which is like the most attractive kind of hardware store you'll ever see in your life. And then we ended up staying the night at a place called the Madrones, which is it's a little kind of complex of Mediterranean style buildings. Complex makes it sound larger than it actually is, but it's basically a B&B, and it's super, super cute. The guys who run it are on site, and and one of the nice things there is that in addition to the rooms, and they only have a handful, they have some extra space that they rent out to other people. So they actually have a couple tasting rooms on site and their own shop, which is really wonderfully curated with lots of great stuff for the home.
It's so amazing to be able to, have access to the amazing wine and food, and then on top of that, to have that personal touch from the people who you meet.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about these kinds of destinations, I think, is that, because they're not wildly commercialized and super heavily touristed, you just, people have a little bit more time, and they're on hand, and they're really excited that you're there. We went for dinner that night to a restaurant called The Bewildered Pig, which is in Philo, which is turned out to be, we did a tasting menu. It's run by a husband and wife team. He's in the front of the house working the room. She's in the kitchen cooking, and the food is so memorable. It's really some of the best food I've had in a long time. I still think about a dish that we had on that tasting menu, which was so incredibly simple. It was a grilled white peach with homemade herbed ricotta cheese, some prosciutto, foraged greens, and some tangerine oil drizzled on top. And, all those ingredients are super simple, but put together, they were all so fresh and put together, just kind of created this, just magic on the plate.
It's pretty amazing that you can remember so vividly the experience or, a meal that you had weeks and months later. That says a lot.
Yeah, no, it's, when you've got those things that really kind of touch you in a way, you really do remember them.
Well, great wine, interesting restaurants, natural beauty, the lure of the open road. It sounds like your Mendocino County road trip checked a lot of boxes.
It really did. I'm gushing a little bit, but seriously, it was a really wonderful trip.
Sounds dreamy. Thanks so much for joining us, Nathan.
Yeah. Thank you, Soterius. It's great to be here.
That was travel expert Nathan Lump. Our next stop is perhaps the most famous thoroughfare in California.
With its Pacific Coast Highway stretching 655 miles, California has one of the most epic road trips you can take. And I'll be traveling through a small but monumental part of it, starting just a few hours south of San Francisco and making my way to the incredible Big Sur.
That's Samantha Brown, the host of Travel Channel shows like Passport to Europe and Girl Meets Hawaii. When I spoke with her, she had just finished work on her latest series, Samantha Brown's Places to Love, which begins with a trip driving south from San Francisco, visiting Big Sur and Monterey.
I think that, Big Sur is one of those places that, is it an actual place? Is it a region? Is it a town? Is it a state of mind? No one really knows who doesn't live right in Big Sur, but we know what it represents, which is the magnitude of California. It's exclamation point. And I've always loved it. I've gone there a few times, and it's, to me, just amazing that on one side of the street of the Pacific Coast Highway, you have the Pacific Ocean and these huge crashing waves, and then you'll come upon a redwood forest, and you'll be so deep within trees that are ancient and larger and bigger in diameter than most homes. And it's truly one of the most remarkable places in the world. And so many travelers think that these huge moments exist outside our country, or maybe they're untouchable, and yet they're extremely accessible.
So if I were planning a quick trip to Big Sur and Monterey, what would my itinerary be, ideally in your mind? What would I have to do to really get the most out of it?
I think one of my favorite spots was this tiny little town called Moss Landing, which I believe is above Monterey. And it had a great restaurant called Hot Enchilada. And the woman who owns it, Kim Solano, opened it maybe 10 years ago. But her father is quite famous in the area, Ray Solano, and he owns the whole enchilada, which opened up in 1979. It's this wonderful father-daughter team. And the food is fantastic. It's Latin American. It's everything from Cuban to Puerto Rican to Mexican, but it's filled with art. And the art is just vibrant in the restaurant. And she also has this beautiful outdoor seating area that's filled with beautiful succulents and plants. And you can hear the ocean in the background. And she talks about just how important it was for her to open up a business that brought all those elements of Monterey Bay together. I think you have to go to the aquarium. You have to. It's wonderful. I've been to Monterey 3 times. I've been to the aquarium 3 times because there's something new to focus on and to really enjoy.
What about wine?
So there are a lot of wineries in this area in Monterey Bay and along towards Big Sur. Can I give you like a specific place too?
Sure.
Okay. Go to the Nicholson Winery because it's family owned and it's only, I want to say 3 to 4 acres. That's it. And so even though California is known for this massive wine industry, it also has these tiny, tiny boutique places that literally just sell their wine at their winery. Kind of like not quite out of the trunk of their car. It's actually a really nice winery, but it's that personal experience that you have at a family-owned place that I think you're going to love. And then head down the coast. And I always say just stop. Just stop. Just pull over. And especially go to the farm stands that you see along the way. And we stopped at a beautiful one called Pizzini's Farms. And this has been a farm since 1929. They've been growing artichokes, and it's all from one root that the great-great-great-great-grandfather brought over from Sicily.
Wow.
We stopped at, and I say we because I'm with a camera crew, but we stopped off at the state park Garapata. And it's one of the few places that you can really get on the beach once Big Sur starts to happen, because after a while there are, 500-foot sea cliffs. And so that feeling of walking on the beach and feeling literally the power of the Pacific Ocean, because these waves crash very close to shore. And you feel that power. And in the distance, you can see whales. And that's a state park that again, this is totally free. This is something we all have access to. And so make sure that you stop at that state park.
Do those ridiculous views of the Pacific coast in Big Sur, do they still take your breath away? You've been there several times now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, 2 of our crew members are like from Santa Barbara, and they were just like, oh, my gosh, I cannot believe this. Yes, that's just unbelievable. So even people from California never take it for granted.
All right. Thanks so much, Samantha.
Great.
Coming up, what's on your bucket list? Whatever you're looking for, you have a good chance of finding it here in California. Maybe it's a night under the stars of Death Valley or a tour of the latest architectural wonders of Southern California. We'll talk about those as well as olive oil, craft breweries, and more, all coming up on the California Now podcast. Author Sam Lubell has written 8 books on architecture, including the fascinating Mid-Century Modern Architecture Travel Guide. I asked him to design a road trip, taking in some of the best in recent California architecture. We started in San Diego and worked our way north.
Probably my favorite new building there is the Central Library in San Diego by Rob Quigley. And essentially what he did there, this library took so long to build, but essentially he's bringing back the idea of this sort of take your breath away, awe-inspiring central space, sort of an atrium to reading room where you look up and in several floors up at a time, and sort of it brings sort of the grandeur back to architecture spaces in a really contemporary vocabulary.
That sounds very cool. What's next?
Probably the next one is in Anaheim. And that is the new Arctic train station, not Arctic like in the Arctic, but Arctic, which is a long acronym that I won't get into. But essentially, it's a train station that was built to anticipate high-speed rail coming to the state, but it's already being used for regular rail and also to host buses and other forms of transportation. And it's also bringing back the idea of the cavernous space, which you can see I love, and the sort of drama to architecture. It's one continuous hall. That on top is actually covered with plastic panels. They're called ETFE panels. They're inflatable, and that basically helps with insulation, but it also allows for natural light to come into the space from all around it, and it opens it up, and it's really one of the coolest new spaces in California.
Nice. I'm guessing LA has got to have some cool buildings, right?
LA definitely has some cool buildings and a lot of cool architects, but probably my favorite, not original, the newest the new major art museum is the Broad, which is built by Diller Scofidio and Renfro, and it's on Grand Avenue in downtown LA. It's really injected a lot of energy into that area, and it's the art collection of Eli Broad, one of the richer men in LA, and it's basically it's got sort of this waffle exterior made out of it's really high-tech fiberglass panels that were sort of formed in a pattern that you really couldn't do without computer fabrication. And inside, you kind of take this long escalator tube ride up from this kind of cave-like first floor up to this open and completely spacious second floor where you're bombarded by art, but also bombarded by natural light, which is rare in art spaces.
Right. Where to next?
Next, I would go up to Silicon Valley. I would kind of look at a group of buildings, and that's the new buildings by the monster tech companies. That includes Apple, Samsung, and Facebook. And Apple, the new headquarters by Foster and Partners, is incredible. Like Apple, it's an incredible kind of perfectly detailed building. It's a giant disc known as a lot of things, flying saucer, donut, and in the middle there's a giant park. It's absolutely wonderful, except that you can't really visit it. You can only overlook it from the visitor center, and that's very Apple, and it's closed off, and there's walls around it. So urbanistically, I'm not a fan, but architecturally, I am. Samsung's new headquarters was designed by NVVJ, and the idea of that is to actually build towers around central courtyards that keep repeating every few floors, so that employees will walk out into natural spaces as often as they can and interact as often as they can in the outdoors, which makes a lot of sense in California. And on the lower level, there's public plazas that people can walk through. So that urbanistically works a little bit better. And then finally, Facebook by Frank Gehry. And the best part of that project, also very private because it's Facebook, is a roof, a planted roof where basically the whole staff hangs out most of the time, and really a smart use of a green roof. So those are some of the many new tech headquarters, and Google's trying to catch up, so they're coming soon too. And we have to hit San Francisco, right? Yes, definitely have to hit San Francisco. And my favorite building there is actually not quite done, but it's the Transbay Transit Terminal, actually meant to be the other end of high-speed rail, but also hosts a lot of other transportation options. Sort of an incredible open space, again, bringing in natural light and bringing in sort of that cavernous feeling of the old train stations that you see in Europe. But the highlight is also another green roof, and it's basically a giant park. I don't know how many acres, but it's several acres, and it's got meandering pathways through it, and it's a public park on top of the building, which I think is really, really a smart design.
All right, so we have time for one more cool new building. What do you choose?
I go to Oakland, actually. It's not brand new. It was built in the last maybe 10 years, but it's a cathedral. It's the new Oakland Cathedral. It's called the Cathedral of Christ the Light, and it's by SOM. And if you like to be inspired by holy spaces, it's a great place to go. It's really it's a modern interpretation of a cathedral with sort of a fabricated screen in the back that really dappled light comes through, incredibly huge glue lamp beams that are sort of curved, and really just a breathtaking, inspiring space, which in architecture is the best thing I can ask for.
That was fun. We just traveled over 500 miles in 5 minutes with author Sam Lubell. We'll have the links to his work, including the Mid-Century Modern Architecture Travel Guide at visitcalifornia.com/podcast. That's where you'll find info on all the people and places you learn about here. For our next stop, we'd better fill up the tank and have plenty of bottled water on hand. We're heading to Death Valley National Park with author Matt Jaffe. Everything about the region is extreme. The park covers 3.3 million acres and is bigger than any other national park in the lower 48. It's also the hottest and driest place in America, with summer temperatures peaking north of 120 degrees. But Matt told me it's well worth the drive.
Death Valley is one of those places that really reorients your sense of what the world's about. I know that sounds a bit grandiose, but it is true, especially when you're coming from a major city like Los Angeles and you get out into this really vast expanse, and with huge skies, towering mountains, salt flats, you name it. There's a real feeling of liberation where you're kind of reminded just how big the world really is.
All right, I buy that. So your mission today is to help us hack Death Valley. By the time our conversation is over, our listeners should have enough information to begin planning a trip of their own. So are you up for the challenge?
I am.
Okay, great. Let's start with a bit of geography. I feel like I know where Death Valley is on a map generally, but how remote is it? Like, how long does it take to get there from, say, Los Angeles?
You can get to Death Valley in under 5 hours, and it's actually a pretty easy drive from LA. It's northeast of the city. You basically shoot up State Highway 14 and take a few more roads, and again, it's an easy drive, and it's a spectacular drive too, because one of the things I find remarkable about California, and especially Southern California, is how quickly you can get out of the city and just be into a very different world.
It sounds like actually just getting to the park makes for a great road trip.
Oh yeah, it's a terrific road trip. You're not on any kind of major freeways once you're outside the LA area. It's much more 2-lane roads, very drivable roads. Nothing too hectic. And again, just beautiful scenery, Joshua trees in some places, some spectacular views along the way.
All right, so help us build an itinerary. We drive to Death Valley. Mm-hmm. We show up on a relatively cool, say, winter day. What should we do first?
The classic thing to do in Death Valley is to wake up before dawn and to go over to Zabriskie Point, which is really just a couple miles from the main area where you would stay there. Zabriskie Point is famous for as the sun comes up, it begins to light up the Badland formations right below the point, particularly this one kind of triangular outcropping called Manly Beacon. And it's just remarkable to watch the change in color as the sun comes up higher. And then the other thing that's happening is that the Panamint Mountains on the other side of the valley begin lighting up. And whereas the foreground is going to be all kind of golds and yellows, the Panamint Mountains are going to take on kind of a pinkish purple cast. And that really is kind of the definitive morning experience in Death Valley. And there are going to be a lot of people out there, but even though it's not necessarily an experience of solitude, you're going to be blown away.
Yeah, it's not something you see every day, right?
No, definitely not. And it's a great photographic challenge too to just get that great moment. And then right by there's a very easy dirt road that explores another area of Badlands in 20 Mule Team Canyon. And it only goes on for about 3 miles, but it's kind of nice to get out in the middle of some of these formations as opposed to just see them from a distance. And that you can do in maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So before you've even had breakfast, you've had 2 really great experiences.
Being that it's a remote place, are there hotels in Death Valley? I mean, where do you eat? Where do you sleep?
There are a limited number, but there are a couple very special places you can stay. One of which is the Inn at Death Valley, which goes back to 1927. It's a luxury hotel, which you don't expect in Death Valley. I think most people just assume you're going to be camping or
right.
Staying in a very basic motel. But the Inn at Death Valley was recently redone. It had a multi-million-dollar renovation, which was probably the biggest change there in a number of decades. And it's kind of this Mediterranean mission-style inn. It's literally an oasis because it's fed by water from a natural spring. That's what they use for their water supplies. There's a pool that is a steady somewhere between 82, 85 degrees because, it's fed directly from the spring.
Right, just naturally that warm.
Yeah. And the inn has an outstanding restaurant that really tries to emphasize desert-type ingredients, dates and pomegranates and things like that. And there's a spa there, so you're doing anything but roughing it.
I'm guessing we have time for, say, one more stop before we head back to L.A. and civilization. So what's the last best thing to see before we leave?
Oh, it's hard to make a choice, but one of my favorite places in the park, and this is a little bit of a drive going north, more into the northern reaches of the park. There's a spot called Ubehebe Crater, and that's the crater of a volcano that erupted about 2,100 years ago, and it's pretty huge. It was originally about 800 feet deep, but it's been filled in partway with debris over the years, so now it's about 600 feet deep. But there's a trail about 1.5 mile long trail that circles along the rim of the crater, and you get very impressive views out over the landscape. Ubehebe Crater is part of a larger volcanic field, and then just looking down into the crater is very impressive. It's just it's colorful, it's deep, and it goes back to that whole point of how Death Valley recalibrates your sense of the size of the earth, because here it's relative to the rest of Death Valley, it's a relatively small feature, but when you're standing on the rim of it, it just looks enormous.
Matt Jaffe is a veteran travel writer. You can find his prose in Los Angeles Magazine, the San Francisco Chronicle, Sierra Magazine, and many other outlets. Coming up, perfect pairings for your California road trip. We'll visit some of the many craft breweries that make the state a beer lover's paradise. And we'll revisit a story that was a real eye-opener for me. You may have been to a wine tasting before, but have you ever been to an olive oil tasting? That's next on California Now. You probably know that California is far and away the leading producer of wine in the United States, and the wine tasting road trip has become an institution here. But did you know that 99% of U.S. olive oil is produced in California? I recently spoke to a true pioneer of the industry. Tom Curry is co-owner of the Temecula Olive Oil Company. He gave up a 20-year career in the wine industry to work in the Grove.
Well, I like to look at it as I left the wine industry for the glamour of the olive oil industry. So it's the new up-and-coming thing.
Well, it sounds fascinating. Tell us about that. What's your origin story? I mean, how did Temecula Olive Oil Company get started?
Well, both my wife and I were in the wine industry for a long time. She still is in the wine industry. And we just saw the opportunities with olive oil, just like the wine industry was back in the 60s and 70s. People were starting to discover not only new and different flavors in olive oil, but knew that California really had the ability with our just incredible climate and great population to produce some of the best olive oil in the world, just like we were producing some of the best wine in the world. And we wanted to jump on that bandwagon, and we took the leap and did it. It was quite a journey.
Let's look across the entire state for a second. Where else would you send us for a great olive oil tasting experience? You can, craft it as a road trip if you like.
Well, if we're traveling up from Southern California, I would say the first stop is going to be in Paso Robles, and Willow Creek is always a nice olive oil producer, making fine olive oils, just classic California, clean, always well made. You can continue to travel up the coast and go a little inland. I think as a contrast, if you stop in Lodi, which has some great wines, by the way, I love some of the Old Vine Lodi wines, and take a little trip to the Cordo Olive Oil Company. So you'll see with Willow Creek a classic small boutique producer, and then you can go to this Cordo, who is the second largest producer of olive oil in California, and just see the contrast. They're both making wonderful olive oils, just on a different scale and different style. So you get a good contrast. And then traveling up to Sonoma, the Olive Press, who has been around for a long time, they're at the Jacuzzi Winery, and they have a fantastic facility that has a gorgeous tasting room, and you can see the mill right there. So that's a wonderful wine country experience as well.
What about one that's in a surprising location, somewhere you wouldn't necessarily expect to find world-class olive oil?
Well, I think if you travel further up past Sacramento, up into the Sacramento Valley, there's no place better than to stop in, say, in Corning, which is the olive capital of the world. There's a few really good producers in that area. The Corning Olive Oil Company is up there. It has been always the hub of California olives. Anyone that has spent any time in their childhood or anything driving up Northern California might remember the olive pit right off the highway, and there's olive trees all around there. It's kind of a forgotten area as far as wine and those kind of things, but for olive oil, it's really the traditional hub of olives in California.
That's master taster Tom Curry. He's the co-owner of Temecula Olive Oil Company, which has 5 tasting rooms in Southern California. We could go on, and we're going to in future podcasts. This episode must come to an end, but the nice thing about planning a road trip is imagining the sights, sounds, and experiences ahead. And here's one that I can just about taste. I spoke to Jeff Smith, the writer and director of the film Craft, the California Beer documentary, and I asked him to plan the ultimate California craft brewery road trip for us.
I don't know how you could start anywhere but San Diego with 140 plus breweries, one opening at least every week. I don't know how you wouldn't stop at Stone Brewing in Escondido. It's an absolutely amazing experience. It also happens to be in an industrial park, but that's how most brewers are. So if you start at Stone, if you have the time, I'd head west on Highway 78, which is also known as the Hops Highway. There are, 25 breweries between Escondido and the beach. The best part is that you could end the day at the beach at Pizza Port in Oceanside for some great pizza and some great beer.
Okay, so we're heading north from San Diego. Where do we go next?
Yeah, as we head north, I'd stop in Anaheim, in Orange County. There's one great one would be Bottle Logic Brewing in Anaheim. The guys, they're really innovative and are usually in and around the brewery. And like all brewers, they love to talk beer and answer questions. If you had more time, I would head towards LA, up to Long Beach, and stop at one of my personal favorites, Beechwood Barbecue. Not only is the beer amongst some of the best, in my humble opinion, but the barbecue food is killer.
Do they happen to make beer to pair with the barbecue? I mean, is that a thing even?
I don't know that they specifically brew beer to pair with barbecue, but let me tell you, it pairs just fine.
Okay. So what's the next stop on our tour?
I'd have to say Sacramento. The guys at Track 7 always have a really delicious beer selection. They know what they're doing. I think they have 3 locations in Sacramento now, too. They're expanding and making killer beer. And then J.E. at Roostaller grows his own hops and uses local Sacramento hops in all his beer.
I think I actually heard that Roostaller found some of the heritage hops rootstock that was originally used back, before the whole industry went down in Prohibition, which is really cool. So you can actually kind of taste the beer that people were drinking 100 years ago.
Yep. He's brewing one of their original recipes from, 100 years ago.
Do you think, are California brewers kind of pushing the limits in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, just with hops alone, just cramming the amount of hops that these guys have over the years. That's really what West Coast IPA is. But along with hops, the ingredients list is ever-changing and never-ending, from chocolate to cinnamon to habanero peppers, vanilla, one with curry. Everything is possible.
That is really cool. So what's our next stop?
Have to be Chico with the legendary Sierra Nevada. Ken Grossman got his start brewing in his garage and is now considered one of the grandfathers of the industry. Their classic pale ale was first brewed in 1980 and is what many brewers consider their first foray into craft beer.
And the last stop in our California craft brewery road trip is going to be, San Francisco? How do we top off this visit to the state's brewing highlights?
Well, you gotta hit Anchor Steam. Yeah, right there in the heart of San Francisco. It's crammed into a whole block in the middle of the city, which is really not common for breweries. You gotta stop and have one of their fabled steam beers and take the tour here. The copper tanks that they've been using for 100 years are absolutely beautiful. If I had a little more time in San Francisco, I'd stop for a fresh pour of a Hell or High Watermelon at 21st Amendment. It's also right in the city and within walking distance if there happens to be a Giants game.
And that's another good pairing, right? Baseball and beer.
Absolutely.
Jeff Smith is the writer and director of Craft, the California beer documentary. Well, that's it for our special Road Trip Greatest Hits podcast. Getting out on the road and discovering new people and places, that's what this show is all about. We're working on some great new stories to share with you in the weeks and months ahead. Thanks again for listening to California Now. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher. Please subscribe. If you were inspired by this episode and want even more information about motoring around the Golden State, you're in luck. You can find all sorts of great road trip information online. A detailed guide to Highway 1, recommended stops as you explore California's national parks, and much more. Go to visitcalifornia.com/road-trips.